The morning of the auction, there were 80 geese nobody wanted. They came up last, the way the sorry lots always did, run through in the final dusty gold hour, when the good stock was already loaded and gone, and the rail had thinned to the men who stayed to watch a thing die cheap. Cordell Pruitt stood up on his worn wooden block above the pens, with the toothpick working in his teeth and the rolled sail sheet slapping against his thigh, and he ran the lot fast and bored, the way a man runs a chore he has decided beforehand is beneath him. 80 head of gray marsh-geese, he said, culls off a folded-up outfit 2 counties over, an old heavy landrace nobody kept any more. And he did not so much sell them as read them their last rites in that quick dry chant of his that ran the numbers downhill and found no takers to slow it. They were a sorry sight, and the narrator will not pretend otherwise, because the whole weight of what came after leans on how sorry they were that morning. They were feather-picked down to raw pink skin along the necks and shoulders, wormy and dull, their plumage gone the flat, lifeless gray of a thing that has stopped keeping itself. Their feet were scald soft and splayed from standing wet on bad ground, and they moved the way sick heavy birds move, slow and complaining, folding down on themselves in the dirty straw. Their honking came thin and uneven, and did not knit together into the one big warning voice a good flock makes. It came apart in the air like something already given up on, and the rail laughed. It was the easy, certain laugh of men who have never once been wrong in their own accounting, the laugh that costs nothing and buys a morning's worth of feeling shrewd. At the center of it, because there is always a center, stood Dwight Sasser with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops and his arms crossed high on his chest, holding court the way a prosperous man holds court in a county he has decided belongs to him. He was the loudest voice in 3 townships and the richest, a drainage and row-crop baron who had tiled and ditched and plowed every wet acre he could get his hands on into straight black rows of corn, and he looked at the 80 ruined geese the way he looked at anything that had not made a man money, which was as garbage that had not yet been hauled off. 80 head of pillow stuffing, he called them, loud enough to carry. River rats bound for the rendering truck. He offered it to the crowd like a gift, and the crowd took it and laughed again, and Cordell Pruitt's chant kept sliding down and finding nothing to stand on. Then Idella Sowell came down the alley alone. She came in her grandfather's coat, an old canvas barn coat gone soft at the cuffs from decades of his hands, and now hers, and she did not look at the rail of laughing men, and she did not answer them, because she had not come to be looked at or to answer. She came to the pen rail, and she climbed over it, down in among the big slow birds where no buyer with sense would put his good boots. And she crouched there on her heels in the wet straw the way she had been taught to crouch in a pen, low and still and patient, letting the flock decide she was not a danger. She reached out and laid one flat open hand along the back of the heaviest, slowest gander, the one the others drifted toward without seeming to mean to. And she did not grab him, and she did not lift him to check him the way a rough man checks an animal. She just left her hand there, light and open, and she felt down through the ruined feathers to what was underneath, and she looked at him for a long time without saying anything. That was the thing the rail could not read, and would not have believed if she had explained it, which she did not, that under the feather picking and the worms and the scald and the dull staring gray there was heavy sound bone, a deep old frame, the same big-bodied marsh stock her grandfather Ambrose had kept along the wet bottoms his whole life, and had taught her to read with a hand before she was tall enough to see over the pen rail. He had told her, in the flat way He told her everything worth keeping, that anybody could see a fat animal, that seeing a fat animal was no skill at all, and that the whole art of it was learning to see the heavy bird under a bad year, to find the heaviest ones with the slowest feet, and put your faith there. So she knelt in the straw and put her faith there, and she said nothing, and she rose, and she nodded once to Cordell Pruitt up on his block. Pruitt took her bid because it was the only bid, and it was cheap, cheaper than the rendering truck would have paid by the pound, and he did not make a large production out of it. He knocked the lot down to her fast and looked for a check. She did not have a check. She reached into the breast of her grandfather's coat and brought out a plain envelope worn soft at the corners, and she counted the money into Pruitt's dry palm flat, one bill at a time, worn bills laid one over the other, while the whole yard leaned in to watch the strange girl pay cash for garbage. No check, and no note, and no debt to follow her up the hill and sit on the place through the winter the way debt does. She had learned that from the ledger, too, though the rail did not know there was a ledger. When the last bill was down, she folded the empty envelope in half and put it away, and she turned to go, and that was when Dwight Sasser pitched his best line at her. Saving it for the crowd the way a man saves his best line, loud and pleased with himself. She had bought herself 80 funerals on the water, he said. 80 funerals, and she could dig every grave herself when the first hard rain took them. The rail gave him the laugh he had paid for with it, and Idella Sowell did not answer him. She folded the empty envelope away into the coat, and she walked back up the alley the way she had come, alone, with 80 ruined geese behind her that were now hers, and she left him his laugh, because it cost her nothing to leave it. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. If this is the kind of story you stay for, do me a small favor, tap the like button, and in the comments tell me the town or city you're watching from, because I read every single one. Then stay here with Idella, and let's begin. She had not come home because she had a plan. That is the first thing to understand about Idella Sowell, because the county would spend the next year inventing plans for her, schemes and angles and some clever thing she must be up to, and there had been none of it. She had come home because her life in the city had come apart quietly, strand by strand, the way a rope frays when nobody is watching it, a job that thinned out to nothing, a leash she could not hold, rooms that had grown loud and small, until one gray morning there was nothing left holding her there, and one thing left pulling her back, which was that her great-aunt Idella Sowell was failing alone on the old place, and there was no one else to go. Ambrose Sowell had been dead some years by then, but the place was still his the way a place stays a man's after he is gone, still his run-down hill farm above the wet bottoms. And Eldora had stayed on it alone the way the old ones do, past the point of sense and past the point of help, shelling peas on the porch and letting the fences go. So Idella drove home. She turned in at the leaning gray gate, wearing the clothes of home, and the place came up to meet her out of the dusk, the way a hard thing comes up slow. There was the sway-backed barn, gray and weathered and giving at the ridgeline, holding on the way old barns hold on. There was the whole drained, dry county wrapped around this one stubbornly wet meadow at the foot of the hill, everybody else's bottoms tiled and ditched into straight rows, while the Sowell bottoms stayed low and undrained and green-black with old sod and standing water. The last wet ground for miles. There was the hand-cut stone water trough her grandfather had shaped by hand, gone dry now and holding a little dust and a few dead leaves. And there in the weeds by the barn was the rusted 1970s Ford, sunk to its rims and grown up through the floor with pigweed, composing its own obituary a little further every season, a truck that had quit being a truck and become a part of the ground. She sat a moment looking at all of it, and then she went up to the porch where the one light of the place was, and there was Eldora. The old woman sat in the near dark, shelling the last of the peas into a chipped enamel bowl, her hands moving on their own the way old hands move, and she did not act surprised to see her, because Idella Sowell had stopped acting surprised at anything long ago. Idella sat down on the porch step and told her the whole foolish thing she had done that morning, the 80 ruined geese, the cash, the laughing rail, Dwight Sasser and his 80 funerals, told it plain, and waited to be told she was a fool. Eldora shelled her peas and let the story run all the way out, and when it was done she did not scold, and she did not fuss. She said 4 flat words. "Those are the ones," she said, and she went back to her peas, and she offered it not as comfort and not as praise, but as a fact offered for consideration, the way she offered everything, 1/10 of what she thought laid down flat, and the rest kept back behind her steady pale eyes. Idella did not ask her what she meant. You did not ask Eldora what she meant. You carried the 4 words around until they opened. That night the kitchen bulb was dead, and there was no other. So Idella went hunting a candle through the deep drawers of the old sideboard, and in the bottom of one, under folded oilcloth and a coil of soft catch-cord, and the small hoarded things of a dead man, her hand found the ledger. She knew it before she had it out. It was the clothbound book her grandfather had kept his whole life, the cover worn to the weave and soft as cloth, and when she opened it there in the last of the daylight from the window, it was all still there in his square pencil hand, decades of it, columns of weather laid down day on day, rain and frost and the level of the creek, hatch tallies and head counts and the small daily arithmetic of a patient life, and folded into the middle a hand-drawn map of the bottoms with the wet meadow and the creek and marks on it she did not yet understand. She turned toward the front of the book, and near the beginning she found the line. It was underlined, pressed so hard into the paper with the pencil that the graphite shone. The one line in all those pages he had reached down and marked so that whoever came after could not miss it. The drained field drowns, the wet meadow drinks, it said. She read it 3 times in the failing light. Above her on the kitchen wall, where it had hung so long the paper had faded a lighter square around it, was the photograph, Idella Sowell as a young man. Sepia and dust, faded behind cracked glass, standing square among a flock of the same gray marsh geese at the edge of the same wet meadow, unsmiling and dignified, the ledger already tucked under one arm, looking off at his geese and never once at the camera. Idella stood a long while between the underlined line in her hands and the young man on the wall who had underlined it. Eldora came through with her bowl of shelled peas, on her way to bed, and she paused at the girl's shoulder and looked at the open book, and she said only one thing about it. "He underlined that one himself," she said. Then she went on to her bed and left Idella with it. In the morning, Idella drove down to the crossroads store, and she did not buy much, because there was no money for much and no debt to be had for the rest, but she bought one thing on purpose. She bought a plain notebook, green cloth overboard, cheap and stiff and new, and she brought it home and sat down at the kitchen table with her grandfather's ledger open on one side and the blank green book on the other. She copied his first method over in her own hand, the worming and the doctoring and the small, steady feeding, the rotation of the bottoms, taking it down careful, line by line, the way you take down something you mean to be bound by. And when she came to the line that mattered, she wrote it into her own book, too. The drained field drowns, the wet meadow drinks. And then she set the stub of pencil against it and underlined it, bearing down hard, pressing the lead into the new paper until the graphite shone the way his did, pressing the pencil the way he had pressed it, so that whoever came after her could not miss it either. That was the line she meant to hold. She did not yet know how much it would cost her to hold it, or what it would give back. She only knew, the way you know a true thing before you can prove it, that the old man on the wall had left it there for exactly this, and that the whole county was wrong, and that those were the ones. The work started before daylight and did not stop for weeks. She wormed them first, because the old man's ledger said to worm them first, in a column headed only with the word dose and a figure worked out per pound of bird, and she caught them one at a time in the gray cold of the pen with the soft cotton catch-cord off her belt, not chasing them, but waiting for them, letting the flock settle and swirl, and then closing on the near edge of it the way you close a gate, so that the catching itself cost the birds almost nothing. 80 of them, and she learned the weight of each one against her chest, the ones that were only thin, and the ones that were thin and sick both. The scald soft feet that had gone splayed, and tender standing too long in their own filth on a folded-up outfit 2 counties over. Those she doctored a little at a time, not all at once, because Ambrose had underlined a line for that too. Farther back where the everyday work lived, go slow with a starved thing can die of too much help. She fed them small and steady, 3 times through the short day, never the great trough-filling dump the feed-store men would have called generous, and she watched the manure change from the loose green of a wormy bird to something firm and dark and right. And she wrote that down, because he had written it down, and because a thing written down could not lie to you later the way memory could. And when they were sound enough on their feet to want the ground, she turned them out onto the wet meadow, exactly along the rotation his hand-drawn map laid down, the meadow quartered by old sod lines only the map still remembered, so that the flock grazed the far low corner one week, and the creek edge the next, and the risen middle ground after that, never back on fouled grass, always onto clean, moving the way water moves, downhill and unhurried, and in its own time. The neglected meadow had gone rank and hummocked in the years the place stood empty, rush and sedge grown coarse over the good grass beneath, and the geese ate it back the way nothing else could, not a mower and not a torch, grinding the rank growth down with their flat bills and their patient all-day appetite, and paying for it in dark manure that fed the sod they walked on. Week on week the ragged, feather-picked birds she had bought for pillow stuffing filled out from the inside, the dull, staring plumage, going first to a workmanlike gray, and then, where the new feathers came in over the healed skin, to a deep-worked gloss, with a kind of oiled weight to it, so that when the low sun came across them, at the end of a day, they threw back a color the county had forgotten a goose could be. She kept no debt against them. She had bought them with flat cash, and she fed them off the place and off the meadow, and the only ledger they cost her was the green cloth one in her breast pocket, filling now in her own hand under the first method she had copied from his. She held the old hard rule as long as she could. You did not name what you meant to keep for the ground. Because a name was a door you left open, and grief walked in through named doors. Ambrose had never written a single name in 40 years of tallies. His geese were numbers and weights and hatch dates, and she had meant to keep them that way too, and she held that line, and she held it, and she almost held it clean through. But there was one big, slow gander, heavier in the bone than the rest, calm the way still water is calm, who worked out the rotation before she led them, and stood at the meadow gate each morning, waiting to take the flock down to the creek, and who, when the others milled and panicked at some shadow, only lowered his head and walked on, so that they followed him instead of their own fear. She caught herself watching for him the way you watch for a person, and one evening, writing the day up by lantern, she set the pencil down and looked at the blank where a name would go, and then she wrote it anyway, small, the way you confess a thing, Skiff, because he carried them across the water like one, and that was the single name in her book, and she knew it was a door, and she left it open on purpose, and told herself it was only the one. The boy came the way weather comes, without asking leave. Idella looked up from the fence one gray morning, and there was a lean teenage kid in a shapeless flannel and cheap rubber boots standing at the end of the lane with his hands already dirty, watching her move the birds. And he did not say what he wanted, and she did not ask. And after a while he came up and took the second bucket off the ground and carried it down to the water without being told which water, and stayed. Clell Bracken. She learned his name off Eldora, not off the boy, who said perhaps a dozen words a day and none of them about himself. He had the hands, was the thing. You could not teach the hands, and you could not fake them. And his were sure and calm on a frightened bird, gathering it without gripping it, the way it takes most people years to learn, and some people never. He worked harder than she did, and told her less than the geese did, and he watched her work the way she caught herself watching Skiff, learning it without a word passing. And she let him stay because the place had more work in it than one pair of hands could hold, and because she recognized the shape of a person who had drifted up a lane because there was nowhere better to be, having been one herself. Old Dorsey Kellums came to look, which was different from coming to help. He was stooped and gaunt and 70-odd, a pencil behind one ear and a coil of net twine in his coat pocket, and he had mowed marsh hay and worked waterfowl on the wet bottoms back when the county still had wet bottoms to work, before it drained and tiled and plowed them all under into corn. He came up the lane slow and stood at the fence a long while saying nothing, watching the flock move down along the sod line, and then he climbed the fence with the care of an old man who knew exactly what his knees would and would not do, and he crouched among the birds and put his big, calloused, careful hands on the nearest one, and turned it, and read it, the keel, the feet, the set of the feathers, the bright hard eye, the way she had read the gander in the sail pen, and he did not pet it, and he did not coo at it, he appraised it, craftsman to craftsman, and set it down gently, and let it walk off into the flock. He straightened up as far as he straightened at all, and looked out over the worked meadow, the sod coming back green under the grazing, and he said the only thing he came to say, "Your grandfather knew his ground." And then he climbed back over the fence and taught her over the weeks after, without ever calling it teaching, how the old ones set a net, how you read the creek's face for the day's weather, how the wet ground fed a goose things dry ground never could, and it was worth more than any book, except that she wrote it in the book anyway, so it would not die when he did. The eggs came in the deep of it, big and heavy and few at first, and she cracked the first one alone into a white bowl on a gray morning to see what her ground had made, and the yolk stood up in the middle of the white like a small deep sun, orange going near to red, so rich it hardly spread. And she stood a long time looking at it. Then she did a thing she could not have explained to anyone but Eldora. She did not eat it. She left it, that first one whole and unbroken, set alone in the white bowl on the kitchen window-sill where the morning came in, the way you set out the first of a thing that has cost you something, not as food, but as proof. And it sat there in the light while she worked, and Eldora, shuffling past, looked at it, and looked at Idella, and said nothing at all, which was the old woman's way of saying she understood exactly. Word of the eggs traveled the way good things travel, quietly and to the right ears, and one afternoon a plain white van came up the lane, driven by a woman who did not belong to the county and knew it, and did not care. Bettina Cruz, a city chef, dark hair, tied back off a composed face, small wire glasses, a canvas apron she had not taken off for the drive. And she walked the wet meadow in her clean leather clogs, asking questions that were not the questions a buyer asked, but the questions a maker asked: what the geese grazed and in what order, how old the sod was, whether the ground had ever seen a bag of fertilizer, what the birds drank. She crouched and pressed her fingers into the black meadow dirt and smelled them. She had Idella crack her an egg, there in the kitchen, into a clean white plate, and she looked at the standing yolk the long way Idella had looked at it, and she tasted it barely cooked and went still, and then she named a price per dozen that was not the commodity price the county paid, that was 3-4 times it, and paid it out of a worn envelope without a word of haggle, and asked for more than Idella had to give, more eggs than the flock was laying, and, come the fall, the geese themselves, dressed the old way, and drove off in the white van, having asked to be told the day the first of them was ready. And all the while, down at the feed store, where the county's mind got made up, Dwight Sasser held the floor. He had recovered his good humor about her. It made a better story now that the skinny geese had not simply died, that the underestimated girl had nursed them fat, because it gave him a longer rope to hang the ending on. And he leaned on the counter with his thumbs in his belt loops and told the men, not as a taunt now, but as a fact offered up for their consideration, a piece of settled country wisdom, that she'd lose the whole lot by the first hard rain. Waterfowl on a wet bottom, he said, no drainage, no tile, that ground held water like a bucket, and the first real gully washer that came through would stand that meadow in a foot of cold water and drown or chill or scatter every bird she owned, and she'd have learned the lesson her grandfather never did, which was why the old man died poor on the one wet piece of dirt in the county, while the rest of them got smart and drained theirs and got rich. The men nodded, because it was sensible, because everything he said was sensible, because draining the bottoms was the smartest thing their fathers had ever done, and everyone knew it. And it would have been sensible, except for the ledger. Because in the still evenings, when the birds were up and the boy had gone off down whatever road he went off down, and Eldora was asleep, Idella kept going back to it by lantern light, not to the underlined line which she had memorized, but to the weather columns behind it, 40 years of them in Ambrose's cramped patient hand, rain and drought and creek height logged, season on season, and she was looking for something she could not quite let herself look at head-on, because somewhere back in the columns there was one strange wet year. She had glimpsed it and turned the page, twice now, a year where the rain figures ran off the ordinary scale, where his notes in the margin got shorter and harder, and where, she thought, though she had not let herself read it through, the thing he had underlined at the front of the book had first been proved to him. She ran her thumb down the columns toward it in the lantern light, slow, the way you walk up on something you already half know, and each night she stopped just short, and closed the book and told herself she wasn't ready to be told yet. She was not ready. But the ground did not much care whether she was ready. It came the way the ledger had warned it would, which was first as weather and only afterward as ruin, It started as rain and stayed rain, not a storm that broke and cleared, but a low gray ceiling that settled over the whole county and let down water day and night and day again, until the ditches ran full and then over, until the tile lines that drained 10,000 acres of proud row crop bottom ran at their limit and then past it, and then meant nothing at all, because you cannot drain the sky. Idella stood at the meadow gate in her grandfather's coat, with the rain running off the curled brim of her cap, and watched the creek climb. And it did not climb the way a creek climbs in an ordinary rain. Clean and rising, it climbed brown and wrong, thick with the county's dirt, carrying fence rails and a dead cornstalk mat and the topsoil of 100 drained fields, and it kept climbing after it had no business climbing more. This was the 100-year water. This was the one strange wet year come round again to the day, the thing the old man had underlined the book against, and it rolled down out of the hills and out over the county's bottoms, and found them stripped and tiled and freshly plowed bare, and it took them. She heard afterward what it did to Dwight Sasser's ground, and she saw some of it herself when the roads opened, his proud drained acres, the smartest dirt in the county, scoured. The very drainage that made them rich in a dry year damned them in a wet one. The tile and the ditches and the bare plowed slope shed the water fast, and all at once, the way a roof does, and the fast water had teeth, and it cut his black topsoil out in sheets and gullies, and carried it off down river, so that where his corn had stood there was raw yellow clay, and washed-out channels, and a silt of somebody else's ruined field settling gray over the wreck. He had spent 40 years teaching that ground to get rid of water quickly, and it had learned the lesson too well, and the water it got rid of took the farm with it. But the wet meadow did what the underlined line had promised, what it had been promising in a deep drawer for 40 years. The undrained bottom did not shed the water, it drank it. The old sod the geese had grazed back to health held the ground where a plowed field would have torn loose, and the water, meeting the meadow, spread out wide and went shallow and slow instead of narrow and fast. And slow water has no teeth, slow water lays down what fast water tears up. And there, out in the risen middle ground, where the flock had been grazing that very season along the line his map drew, the water uncovered the thing it had all been about. A low-hand laid course of flat stone ran clear across the wet meadow, a check dam, a flood weir, set by hand a lifetime ago and grown over and forgotten, and lately grazed back into the daylight by the geese themselves without anyone knowing what they bared, and as the flood came down the weir caught it and spread it and slowed it further still, backing the water up into a broad shallow sheet across the whole bottom, so that the brown flood dropped its stolen load right there, and the silt that had been another man's topsoil an hour ago settled out soft, and even over Idella's ground as fresh new dirt, laid down free, the meadow growing richer by the inch while the county washed away. And at the height of it she did the one hard thing the ledger asked of her, the thing every sensible man at the feed store would have called madness. She let the water come. She did not pen the flock up on high ground away from it. She did not fight it. She opened the gate and kept the 80 loose and let them go out onto the rising sheet water, because a marsh-goose was made for exactly this, made for it 1,000 years before the county learned to be afraid of water, and Skiff took them. The big slow gander walked down off the sod into the spreading flood as calm as he took them to the creek of a morning, and the flock strung out behind him onto the shining risen water, and they swam it and grazed the flooded margin and rode the shallow current, thriving, wholly in their element, while every drowned field for miles around them failed. Idella stood at the gate with the rain on her, and watched her grandfather's ruin turn out to be his provision, and did not gloat, and could not have if she'd wanted to, because it was too large for that. When the water dropped at last, days on, it left the county brown and gutted, and hers the one green bottom in it, unscoured, unbroken, greener than before, and standing on a finger's depth of new-silt topsoil the flood had paid it. The weir dark and solid across the meadow, where the geese grazed it as though nothing at all had happened. People began to drive out slow along the road above the bottoms, not to say anything, just to stop their trucks at her fence and look down at the one place the water had spared and fed, and more than one of them took his cap off standing there without deciding to, the way a man does at a thing bigger than he is. And up on the porch, frailer now, a blanket over her knees, though the rain had passed, Idella Sowell watched the whole risen, shining bottom, and her great niece standing down at the gate with the old man's cloth-bound ledger held flat against her chest, and she said the only thing that needed saying, spare and flat and complete. The ground remembers, and Idella stood in the wet grass among the birds that were never supposed to live, on the ground that was never supposed to be worth keeping, and felt no triumph in it at all, only awe, and under the awe a grief she could not yet name, that he had known, that he had left it for her, and that he had not lived to stand at the gate and see the line come true. Dwight Sasser came up the lane on foot, which was the first thing anyone noticed, because Dwight Sasser did not walk anywhere he could drive. He left the big clean truck down at the road and came up through the mud in his good boots with his green seed company cap already off his head and turning in both thick hands, turning and turning like a wheel he could not stop, and Idella watched him come from the gate and did not go down to meet him, and did not make him come the last of the way alone either. She simply stood and let him arrive. He got within a few feet and stopped, and he looked out over the risen green bottom where the geese worked the fresh silt in the low gold light, and he looked at the mud on his own good boots, and he said the only 3 words he had walked all that way to say. I was wrong. He did not dress it up. He did not explain about the tile lines, or the 100-year rain, or the way his own proud acres had gone down river in a single brown night. He just set it down between them, plain, the way a man sets down something heavy he has carried too far. And Idella, who had every right in the county to say a great many things, and who had lain awake composing some of them, said none of them. She reached into her coat and brought out the ledger, the cloth-bound one, soft at the corners from her grandfather's hands and now from hers, and she turned to the front, where the pencil line still shone from being pressed so hard, and she turned the book around so it faced him, and she held it up so he could read it. She let the dead man do the talking. Dwight Sasser leaned in and read it slow, moving his lips a little the way men do who read seldom. The drained field drowns, the wet meadow drinks, and something went out of his shoulders that had been holding them up his whole life. He nodded. Once he did not say Ambrose's name, but she saw him think it. Then she closed the book and put it away, and she went to the barn and came back with a basket, and she set it into the 2 hands that had been turning that cap, so that he had to hold it or drop it, and it was eggs, a dozen of the deep-yolked brown ones, still warm from the straw. He looked down at them like a man handed something he did not know how to carry, and that, she thought, was about right. The Tina Cruz came back in the plain white van 3 weeks after the water dropped, and she walked the wet meadow again in her clean clogs and crouched and pressed her fingers into the new dirt the flood had laid down and smelled it, and she cracked a raw egg into a white saucer at the kitchen table and tipped the saucer to watch how the yolk held, standing tall and orange as an autumn sun. And she did not haggle. She named a number that was 4 times the commodity price, and she named it like a fact she was reporting rather than an offer she was making, and she asked, with the careful courtesy of one craftsman to another, to be first in line every single year, first for the flood-fed geese, and first for the deep-yolked eggs, for as long as Idella kept the ground. Idella said she could be first. It was not a hard thing to give. Great-aunt Eldora died on a Tuesday in the last soft week of the fall, in her own bed, with the window open the way she had asked, so she could hear the geese down on the bottom. She went quiet, and she went easy, which the old woman would have said was more than most got and more than most earned. And Idella found her in the morning with her hands folded and her face smooth of its fine, sharp lines, and down through the open window the meadow lay safe and green below her, and that, Idella understood, was the closest thing to a blessing the place had to give. On the nightstand there was a note in Eldora's spidery pencil hand, 4 lines, spare as everything she had ever said aloud. And it said the place was to go to the one who had the hands. She did not write the name. She did not need to. Everyone who had watched that quiet boy move the birds through the high water knew who had the hands, and so did the boy, who did not smile when he was told, only took his gray cap off and held it and looked at the ground for a while. The winter came in clean and cold over a bottom that had come through the flood richer than it went in, the fresh silt drying to good dark tilth, the geese glossed and heavy and loud, and one still evening near the year's turn Idella sat at the kitchen table by the lantern with both books open in front of her, her grandfather's clothbound ledger and her own green cloth notebook, and she wrote the head count tally in her own hand under the long column of his. 80 had come off the sail truck skinny and staring and nobodies. 80 had come through, and more behind them now, and the number she wrote at the bottom was a good number, and she sat with it a long moment. She had thought, back at the auction pen, that if the line ever came true, she would feel something like winning. She did not feel like winning. She felt something quieter and a great deal older than winning, something with her grandfather in it and Eldora in it, and the long, patient wait of people who had worked wet ground the slow right way and been laughed at for it, and there was no word for it in either book. So she did not try to write one. She got up and she took her own green notebook, the one she had bought that first week, and copied his method into and pressed the underline the way he had, and she carried it out to the barn where Clell Bracken was forking down clean straw in the warm lantern light with the big slow gander skiff dozing on his feet nearby. And she put the notebook into the boy's dirty, capable hands, and inside the front of it, pressed flat, one gray goose feather. He looked at it and then at her, and he did not say anything, because he never did, and that was how she knew it was the right pair of hands. If this story reached you, do one thing. Share it with somebody who's been told the thing they love isn't worth much. And down in the comments, tell me the small, stubborn thing you kept on with anyway, and the town you're watching from, because I read every single one.